Hello, OB students, and welcome to the second half of your organizational behavior course. In this second half of the course, we're going to move into topics that are more clearly defined as coming from a psychology sort of approach to what happens or behavior in the workplace rather than a sociological approach, as we saw in the first half, where we looked at in the first half, we looked at the experience of groups, workers, women, people of color, and so on and so forth. And in this last half of the course, we're going to look at theories of motivation, leadership, perception, personality, and teams. And so these are topics that are more typical of a mainstream organizational behavior course. But for the purposes of my course, we're obviously mixing them with the sociological approach as well, a critical approach, and a critical approach, I should say. So in this module, in particular, we're going to look at content theories and process theories of motivation. And there are other theories of motivation as well. But these are the two major areas of research and the material that's presented in most management textbooks for the last 60, 70, 80 years basically. So the content theories are led by Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but we're also going to look at a couple of other researchers who came up with things like the two-factor theory, Hertzberg, and the a simplified version of Maslow's hierarchy is sometimes referred to as the ERG theory, which stands for existence, relatedness, and growth. And it's sort of a version of Maslow's hierarchy. And there's also a learned needs approach from a guy named McGregor. And anyway, so we're going to be looking at these in some depth, and then we're also going to look at process theories, in particular, equity theory, which is a very important theory for understanding why people feel unfairly treated. It helps to understand why people would feel that they are unfairly treated in the workplace. And another theory that is considered by psychologists, at least, considered to be the gold standard of motivation. It's called expectancy theory, and it has quite possibly the best testable predictions. So that tends to make it a good theory for social science, at least. And the psychologists call it the gold standard of motivation, or motivation theory, at least. We're also going to talk a little bit about the difference between intrinsic motivation, that is, motivation that comes from within the individual, and extrinsic motivation that comes from outside of the individual. We are missing a couple of topics that would normally be covered in an organizational behavior intro course. One is culture, and we just don't have enough time for it, but it's very interesting, of course. But culture basically is not maybe what you think it is, but it's anything that is learned and passed on. So imagine, for instance, that a dog, or dogs generally, don't have culture because they don't pass on learning. Whatever they have learning-wise is either idiosyncratic, that is, it's limited to the individual dog, or it is instinctual. It comes from, basically the instinct of the dog rather than culture that is passed on or learning that is passed on. Humans have learning that is passed on from generation to generation. Orangutans have culture, learning that is passed on from generation to generation. Now, how do we know that? Well, there's an example. I don't think it's in your textbook, but I remember an example from a few years back of a primatologist describing how orangutans in one community learned how to harvest coconuts in one way and then pass that knowledge on to the next generation. And a few miles away, 30, 40, 50 miles away, something like that, a different community of orangutans would harvest the coconuts a different way, and that different method would be passed on from generation to generation. So you have essentially two different cultures evolving because of the distance between the two populations, but in both respects, they're ways of learning that was then passed on. The other topic that is quite often covered in an introduction to organizational behavior is a chapter on learning, or the topic of learning. How do we create workplaces where workers are encouraged and even motivated, dare I say, to learn, to become more capable, rather than just to maintain their capability, but to actually become more capable. And it's an important topic in organizations as well, and in management terms, because generally you would want a workforce that is capable of learning how to become more effective at their work. Um, yeah, so we'll move on from here. Well, one of the challenges, I guess, of the topic of motivation, and this is just a very basic introduction, by the way. There are more complex approaches, but you'll find the theories that we're going to examine in this module. They show up in places like compensation management. You know, how to develop a compensation plan. Uh, a good compensation plan has essentially a theory of motivation, or several theories of motivation underpinning it. How do we build a system of reward in an organization that will motivate people to fulfill the mission of the organization? So, but on the face of it, what may seem very simple to many of you is actually very complex. It's not a there are very few simple answers in the area of motivation. Um, and let me give you an example, as exemplified on this particular slide. Think of the motivation of a worker at a McDonald's restaurant as compared to the motivation of a doctor working for Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders. You know, the kind of motive behind a doctor going and working in probably terrible conditions, you know, virtually anywhere in the world, but quite often in places that are racked by war and poverty and starvation and so on, and disease, of course. Think of the motivation it takes to go do something like that compared to going and working at a McDonald's restaurant. And yet, we need, in order to better understand why people do stuff, we kind of need good theories of each. So, in terms of theories of motivation in the workplace, there are a number of assumptions that underlie, I should say, these various theories. And first is that the motivation of the employee improves their performance in some way. What they output, the outcomes of their performance. And so there are different ways of measuring. Output is measured in many different ways in a workplace. And so what I find with new business students in particular is that it takes a while for them to get a feeling for what particular outcome they are working on when they're trying to solve a workplace problem. They usually get that wrong in the beginning, but with practice and more knowledge, you get better at it. Another assumption underlying motivation is that we're trying to gain a better understanding of why workers do what they do. And a good knowledge of motivation should enable managers to cause their workers, their subordinates, to act in a particular way, to contribute to the mission of the organization. Third, if managers are interested in motivating and creating sufficient job satisfaction, work will be done adequately or even better and continually improved. So how do we create a workplace culture that can reward good performance and encourage good performance? It's not that straightforward. So, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to examine in a fair amount of detail two sets of theories, one called the content theory, a set of theories, and the other the process theories. The content refers to what is in us that motivates us, what needs in particular do we have, what is the content of our needs, and how do we fulfill those needs, and how they move us to do things in the workplace. And then the process theories, they describe the process of being motivated rather than the content of what motivates us. So that should make more sense as we go through these different theories. As you know, everything we do in this course will be balanced with a critical perspective. And so, as a beginning point on these critical perspectives, one of the problems is that there are many problems with theories of motivation. We have suspicions about what they actually mean, how they operate, and just how important they are to human behavior. And so one of the problems is that it's just another problem. It appears to present management with just another problem to solve. So it's another way to problematize workers rather than to problematize managers. So if we flip the telescope on its end and we look back at managers, maybe part of the problem of motivation of workers is the manager, and not what's in the worker, but what's in the manager. But you see, so many of these theories they look at the worker rather than the manager. So this is one of the reasons why this presentation today is overly simplistic in many ways, because it doesn't consider the manager. Well, actually, it will. One theory in particular will, and that's equity theory. Okay, so then the other thing about this is that much of what we think is or is presented to you as if it's universal knowledge, and I've said this to you guys before, but much of what we've presented to you in your business program is really Western thinking, but it's presented as if it's universal. It is definitely not. It reflects more the Western culture, Western being Europe, North America in particular, Australia, New Zealand, but all of these countries and regions originated essentially in a Eurocentric view of the world, and even in Europeans spreading out into the world. So they reflect that Western culture, Western notion of what's important. Another problem, I guess, with this is that none of these theories are sufficient on their own, and so the more nuanced your understanding of various theories of motivation, the better you'll be able to respond to particular workplace challenges of figuring out what actually will work with certain workers. There are some other challenges as well. How does our behavior, as in terms of motivation, how has it changed because of the revision of the employment relationship? The employment relationship today is quite a bit different than the employment relationship of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and even into the 1980s. And since the 1980s in particular, the relationship between worker and employer is it's not a lifelong relationship anymore. Not that it ever truly was, but work relationships tended to be for a much longer period of time when you go back 3, 4, 5 decades ago. So that the nature of the relationship has changed quite a bit since these theories were first, put forward. We also know that beginning in the 1980s, in North America in particular, organizations became flatter. So the span of control, I don't know if you've heard that term before, but that's a a sort of core idea of management. The span of control refers to the number of workers who report to a particular manager or supervisor. So if I have 5 people reporting to me, I have a span of control of 5, and if that's the average across the organization, then on average, every manager would have about 5 subordinates reporting to them. Now, what if we doubled that to 10? And then what if we doubled that to 20? So the span of control in flatter organizations is actually quite a bit bigger. There are usually more people responding or reporting to a manager today than, again, 40, 50, 60 years ago. So the span of control is getting bigger today. So what are the implications for motivation theory? And then finally, do we have generational differences? Now, your generation and any other generation other than my generation always has claimed that they're different in some way than the generation that went before them. I think we have more in common than we do different, but it's possible that the needs of your generation will be different than the needs of my generation. Certainly they will. And you guys, just on the file called climate change alone, you guys have a really terrible hill to climb compared to when I was your age. So yeah, there are definitely some differences. And in terms of your motivation, I urge you to become motivated about reducing your carbon footprint. Find a way to reduce, even the small amount you think you produce. Like, you're not the problem. Well, if you're not thinking about how to reduce your footprint, you are part of the problem. It's a collective issue. We all need to deal with it. So think about how you're going to be motivated. For me, it's doing the right thing. It's ethics for me. That's not all it is, but because I do also try to build in some financial reward for what I'm doing as well. So I'm not entirely philanthropic. My motivation can also be financial. But the mission is very explicit, and that's to stop burning stuff in my life as much as possible, or at least making amends for anything that I do burn. So I mentioned when just beginning in several slides ago that in addition to the content and process theories, there's also this sort of a dichotomous way of thinking of motivation as either coming from within the individual or from outside sources. So from within the individual, we refer to intrinsic motivators, something that is intrinsic to the individual or innate to the individual. So as an example, excitement of facing work's challenges, the pride in making a difference, the personal development or growth that may result. When I meet you in class, I will try to show you some workers, a couple of examples at least of workers who are deeply intrinsically motivated by their work in at least 2 organizations that I follow very closely. Now the opposite of that is extrinsic. Are we doing our work in order to get paid, for instance? Well, salary or pay compensation is generally considered to be an external reward. And what you will discover, even though today you may feel like pay is like all that's important to you because maybe you don't have a lot of money to begin with, so pay is very important to you. Once you do get paid a decent wage, more pay doesn't tend to be as motivational. So money or compensation of one sort or another tends to lose its impact on our motivation as we get more of it. It's not infinitely motivational. And so extrinsic rewards tend to be less powerful than intrinsic reward. And intrinsic reward, like personal development, for instance, and growth, they can be a lifelong kind of pursuit that something that motivates you for the whole of your life. So for in my own example, for instance, I hope to, I get a lot of reward from paddling and being in the outdoors, and I hike across countries, and I'm hoping to get back to that next year because I've, been offline essentially because of two hip replacements, but I hope to get back to that by next year because I find that so deeply rewarding. And in paddling and kayaking, stand-up paddleboard, canoeing, and so on. These are rewarding to me as well, and it's mostly because it's a challenge. I'm challenged by my own performance, to do better the next time. So it tends to be an intrinsically motivating thing. Extrinsically, I love payday. I don't want to do without payday, and that's one of the reasons I probably won't retire for 2 or 3 more years because payday still has a lot of meaning to me. Not as much as the intrinsic things that will keep me going for the rest of my life, but at the moment, it's still important to me. And I also like winning things. So, when you win an award for your work, it has a great resonance. But again, that comes from outside the individual, and it tends to be short-lived. Actually, let me tell you a short story about an award I won a few years ago for ethics in business, and I won about a $2,000 prize. Not a big payday, but not bad. I didn't flush it down the toilet or anything, but it didn't make a whole lot of difference in my life. What I would have done if I were the organization, which was an organization focused on ethics in business in Toronto, what I would have done instead of providing a $2,000 award is provided a $2,000 or maybe $1,000. I don't know what you can do for 2,000, but like $1,000 certificate framed, beautifully framed and embossed in gold or whatever, something that I could put up in my wall and generate, that would create sort of an intrinsic sort of sense, an innate sense of, why that work was important to me, because the money made almost no difference. $2,000 when you're earning six figures is not much. It just doesn't have a big impact on you. So why not take at least half of that money and turn it into something that, I could really, display with a lot of pride, not just to other people, but to myself as well. And so just think about how, these things influence you today and in the future. So as I mentioned, we're going to look at content theories or needs theories. They're also referred to as needs theories and process theories as two different areas of theories of motivation. And this is a somewhat simplistic way of looking at the topic, but these are very common theories of motivation, and they show up in other parts of business study as well. So in terms of the needs or content theories, everything really starts with Maslow. And in fact, if you look on Acorn, you'll see that I've provided his very first paper on his needs hierarchy, which was published, I think, in like 1941 or 43 or something like that. So if you're interested, you can read that and see what he was thinking. We're going to talk a little bit about that for sure. And then a couple of follow-up theories, in particular, Hertzberg's two-factor theory, which is, in a sense, just a different version of Maslow's theory. And then McClelland's learned needs, which is a little bit different, actually, primarily because in terms of Maslow and Hertzberg and also McGregor, they're thought to be theories that are innate. We're born with these needs, or these characteristics, whereas with McClelland, he thought that these needs could be or were learned rather than innate to the individual. So a major difference in his theory was that we learned these needs. And there's also another one called innate drives theory, which is shares a little bit in common with all of these as well. And then in terms of the process theory, we're going to look particularly at expectancy theory and equity theory, But there's also goal setting theory, another very powerful way of thinking about how do you get people to do what you need them to do? How do you get yourself to do what you need to do? So I remember a friend of mine decades ago telling me about his how he motivated himself to read stuff that he didn't really want to read. He turned out to be a lawyer and a member of parliament and all that sort of stuff. So he would set himself small goals on a daily basis, like read a page or two of whatever it was he needed to read. And then, so after 30 days, he'd have, 30 or 60 or 90 days or 90 pages read. And then after 3 months, he'd have the whole book read or something like that. So that was he was essentially breaking down the book into a small set of smaller goals, and so more achievable on a daily basis, so he could feel like he's achieving something on a regular basis, rather than feeling discouraged because he hadn't finished that 500-page book yet. So this is actually the exact same way that Weight Watchers works. They instead of going to Weight Watchers to lose 20 pounds, you go to Weight Watchers in order to get that 20 pounds broken down into daily goals, which might amount to, like 20% of a pound, half a pound, something like that. And so we, as an example, Weight Watchers, and there are others like Jenny Craig and probably some others as well that are built very, very similarly. They are very successful weight loss programs because they are based on very solid goal setting theory. So I'm not going to go into much of the goal setting theory in this particular module, but it's well worth figuring out. If you have something that's important to you that you want to accomplish, you should think about how you set effective goals. That's basically goal setting theory. And then the other thing, oh yeah, equity theory, expectancy theory, goals and feedback. Feedback does not refer to, your boss giving you feedback. Feedback is the feedback you receive from doing the job itself. So writing a paper and then being able to sit back and say, oh, my paper's done. Yay. So you get feedback from completion of the assignment, let's say. Here's a more work-related sort of thing. Maybe you've installed a stereo or something in your car at some point, and how do you know whether you did a good job? Well, when you're finished hooking it all up, you turn the on button, or push the on button, and if noise comes out of the stereo, that's feedback as to whether you did the job well or not. That kind of feedback from the job gives you a sense that you are, well, without that, for instance, you would perhaps lose interest in the job. Um, just this past week, actually, just after I last saw you about a week and a half ago, there was a big event in Hollywood, of all places, by Tesla Cars, where they introduced their new robo taxis. So these are two-seat taxis that will be autonomous. They will be able to come and pick you up at your door and drop you off wherever you need to go. And they will behave without. They will do this without a driver. And so why am I bringing this up? Well, the event itself was like a celebration of the work of the engineers at Tesla who are developing these projects. The other project they sort of pushed forward as a demonstration was the humanoid robot, or sometimes referred to as Tesla Bot, or it actually goes by different names, Optimus sometimes. Anyway, you could see in the Tesla employees who were there the immense pride they had in showing their work to about 2,000 people who were invited, kind of like a big birthday party in a sense. And the 2,000 were able to take drives in the robo taxis. They were able to interact with the Tesla bots. and so on. And so what I'm trying to point out, I guess, is that for the workers, so this was an event not just for the public, but also for the workers, to give them feedback about the just how good their work is and what an impression it made. The people who were there were just, gobsmacked. They loved what they were seeing. The Tesla share price went down the next day, but that's because the investor community tends to be stupid. But oh well. But that's feedback, right? So that is the workers receiving feedback, seeing their creations do amazing things, even though it was in a very controlled environment. We will see these things out in the real world, um, basically slowly revealed to us over the next 2 years, some as early as about 6 months from now. Yeah, so it's that sort of feedback mechanism. And one of the areas that I have been interested in for pretty much my whole career as an academic is organizational justice. So justice and equity theory have something they're very closely related in that they can both be used to understand why people feel either justly treated in the workplace or unjustly treated in the workplace. And one of the best ways to demotivate somebody is to treat them unfairly. It's a very quick way to undermine their motivation and perhaps even motivate them to leave the organization. So we will be talking in particular about expectancy theory and equity theory, though, in this module. So just a quick sort of thought experiment. It was about, God, I think it was about 20 years ago now that Canadian Olympic athletes, other nations were paying their athletes for medals, and I think it was about 20 years ago, Canada started paying our medal winners as well. Before that, money for athletes, amateur athletes, to support was only to support their training, and so you got carded and you would receive a certain amount of money depending on whether you were card A or card B or whatever kind of athlete. But and I guess enough Canadians wanted to see better performance in the Olympics. So, well, let's pay for medals and see what happens. And so I think today we still do the same thing, and other nations do as well, by the way. And the question is that the best way to motivate? Will it produce medals? It probably did, but it's, the question is that really the only measure of success? Is it, the kind of life that person builds for themselves, or is it that one-time glory of winning a medal? That's the most important thing in their life. So anyway, we could have lots of debates about whether paying athletes for medals is a good thing or not. And so basically this is a discussion about what's more important: intrinsic reward, the reward of being a high level athlete, or the extrinsic reward of being paid for good performance, or high performance, or extraordinary performance. Once again, I have to apologize. This is going to be a long lecture. I tried to cut it down a bit, but I think I want to cover all of these topics. So it's going to be a long one. Sorry, you can listen to it on double speed if you need to, but it's going to be fairly long. So let me introduce you first of all to the first content theory, or needs theory, from Maslow. And as I said, you can find the paper that this is based on in our tidbits folder on Acorn. So what you'll find represented in management books going all the way back to the 1957, I believe it was. There was a book by a guy named Keith Davis. He was a big wheel in the early management academy, we'll call it, business academy. He'd actually been an HR guy in the Navy in the Second World War, and when the war was over, I think he went back for his PhD. And he was a big wheel in the Academy of Management, in the 1950s and 60s, and one of the first presidents actually of the Academy of Management. And so he wrote what was called at the time, I think it was called uh, Social Relations in Business or Human Relations in Business. Human Relations in Business, I think it was called. And that book actually later became a Canadian HR textbook, which I still use in the classroom in its 14th or 15th edition. Anyway, so the guy's name was Davis. But anyway, what you find is one of the very early representations of Maslow's hierarchy is not presented like this. It's presented as a series of steps, but it has the same sort of idea that the worker is motivated to keep moving up the steps from basic physiological needs to higher and higher self-actualization needs. And in his representation in his textbook, at the highest level, self-actualization, there was a flag, and essentially the worker was moving toward capturing the flag at the top of these steps. So there have been different representations of this hierarchy, but they all have the same basic underpinning. What's interesting, though, in terms of what's presented in the textbooks, is that we usually only see 5 of the needs described by Maslow, and there's at least 2, and I think there may have been a third one that left out as well. But you can see them here to the right of this pyramid: the need to know, or curiosity, and the need for beauty, sometimes referred to as aesthetics. Music, literature, art, and so on. These are thought to be aesthetic sort of human needs. They're not easily quantified. They're not easily, and there's different. You've heard the term or the phrase, "Beauty is in the eye of the beholder." So you generally speaking, you can't quantify beauty or aesthetics. It's something up to the individual. And so for me, for instance, fairness or ethics in the workplace, that's a thing of beauty. It almost never exists, but it's a thing to strive for. It's a thing of beauty. It matters to me. But those 2 things, curiosity and beauty, they didn't show up. They almost never show up in any representation of Maslow's theory. And so one of the questions you might want to ask yourself is, well, why not? And when this was first published in 1957 in Davis's textbook, think about the employers of that time. They were tall, militaristic kinds of corporations who really didn't want a lot of creativity or curiosity from their workers. They wanted workers who would just do what they were told, very similar to a sort of military organization. And of course, many of the workers in those organizations were soldiers, sailors, airmen, and so on during the Second World War. So they were used to this sort of hierarchical, authoritarian way of organizing, and so it was relatively easy to convince them that curiosity and beauty and so on really that's not part of business. Don't even talk about it. So they get left out. So we all pretty much always see it as the 5 categories. One more final thing about Maslow's, well, there will be more coming actually, but on this slide, recently Maslow's hierarchy has not been as represented in the textbooks. But quite often happens is that some editor or other will look at a textbook that doesn't include Maslow's hierarchy, and they'll say, well, "Where's Maslow? Why don't you include?" And then the authors will include it simply because somebody says, due to popular demand. But Maslow's hierarchy is, even though it's very interesting still, and should be discussed, it's not as relevant as it once was, and there are alternatives that seem to work better, especially in academia. So it's lost some of its charm, some of its luster, but it still does show up in management textbooks. So how does it work? First of all, the theory is that the lowest part of the pyramid, which is the physiological needs, if they're unmet, they create the biggest motivation. So the lowest unmet need, as you can read here in the pyramid, tends to have the strongest effect on the individual. So just think, for instance, of the problem we have in Halifax and elsewhere today as well, with many people living in tents, because they either choose, I guess, or cannot afford the rents for basic apartments, for basic accommodations. And so many choose to live in tents instead. So we kind of find that a challenge and off-putting and disappointing that we have such a productive society, and yet people can't afford to live somewhere, what we would consider a sort of normal household. So that's sort of the lowest need. Now those people may be working full-time jobs, so they may be also working on higher level needs at the same time. This is one of the criticisms actually of Maslow's hierarchy, that lower level needs may be in effect at the same time as higher level needs are. That it's not as predictable as it's described, at least. So but in theory at least, when the lower level need is satisfied, then something higher than that becomes the primary motivator. So once you've got a roof over your head, let's say, then the need for long-term security might be more important, or safety. Living in a tent is not exactly the safest way to live your life. But at the same time, somebody might be living in a tent, which may provide basic physiological need. They may also have social needs met by the community. These tents often pop up in places where other people are also living in tents. So there's a community. Their social needs may be met by that community. And difficult to anybody who owns their own home, or is able to rent a nice apartment or something like that, they're probably wondering how do you maintain your self-esteem when you can't look after these lower level needs. So esteem or self-esteem is one of these higher level needs, and esteem represents a sort of breaking point from what's called the lower level needs, beginning with physiological, safety, and belongingness or social needs, and then the higher level needs, self-esteem and self-actualization. So the higher level needs are thought to be more motivating than the lower level needs, and provide an ongoing sort of motivation. I mean, once you have your basic physiological needs looked after, they're not as motivating as becoming more than you are, self-actualization. So self-actualization, that's where that flag was in Davis's illustration of Maslow's hierarchy. It was this flag that everybody was thought to want to capture, self-actualization, to become more than you are today, the desire to realize your ultimate potential. And it's considered, so those top two are considered growth needs, esteem and self-actualization, largely because they're thought to never really run out in terms of their motivating potential. So we always desire more self-esteem and more self-actualization. Remember, this is in theory. So Maslow thought the highest level need was self-actualization. And in fact, you'll discover later on, I think, in my notes, that self-actualization is kind of like an endless sort of opportunity to get motivated, because each individual can become more than they are throughout their lifetime. So let me read from that paper I was talking about from 1943, written by Maslow. It's, as I said, I've got a copy of it in the tidbits file. So this is his description of self-actualization. A musician must make music, an artist must paint, a poet must write, if he is to be ultimately happy. What a man can be, he must be. This need we may call self-actualization. It refers to the desire for self-fulfillment, namely to the tendency for him to become in what he is potentially. Notice, first of all, that he refers only to men. And of course, the argument would be, well, we're referring to man as a species, not man as a sex. But still, it doesn't need to be. If we were writing this today, it would be just completely inappropriate to use the term man, person, or human, or whatever. But get over your sexism. Anyway, the other thing though is that Maslow has been criticized for elitism. That his focus seems to be more on the very elite of society, the musicians, especially the violinists and the cellists, the classical musicians kind of thing, and the artists, the very greatest artists and sculptors and all that sort of stuff. And so it has a whiff of elitism built into it. But to defend Maslow though, when he came to America when it was in the 1930s, and he was a German Jew, and he could see the writing on the wall in Germany and knew that he had a way out to America to escape the Nazi party and the rise of Nazism, fascism in Germany. And even though the U.S. and Canada too, to some extent, had its own fascist movements and Naziist movements, as we do today, in fact, it was a more free and open society, and he really celebrated and made lots of commentary about how freeing it felt to come to this new country that was less stratified, less there were fewer hurdles to self-actualization, and so he just marveled at this change of culture in this new country, and many other German Jews also followed, or at least did the same thing Maslow did. They left Germany. They knew things were going badly wrong, and they knew they would have opportunity. And again, this is sort of elitist because these German Jews tended to be the top of whatever profession they were in, professors or medical or whatever. And ordinary Jews were quite often turned away from Canada and the U.S., both before, during, and after the Second World War. So this was he was lucky because he was an elite talent. Anyway, it begs the question, in terms of organization, should managers be expected to help individuals to self-actualize? Is there an responsibility? And I would argue at least some. I don't know if I'd go, because the business still has a need to succeed, to survive. But in the long run, I think there is a need for a responsibility for managers to be concerned about the spiritual health of their workers. In the short term, I don't know that they can do a lot about that, but in the long term, I think they should be concerned about it. And then, but what about all the others? So if this is an elitist sort of approach to motivation, what about the rest of us? What if we can't do jobs that are ultimately, self-actualizing, that keep delivering and on our higher level needs? What if you work on the back of a garbage truck? Or there are all kinds of dirty jobs that people do because they need to earn a living to have the other parts of their life. So does this not apply to them? Does it apply in some different way? Why do we produce jobs that aren't self-actualizing? Okay, so let's look at an application of what we learned about Maslow. By the way, I should have explained what each of those means. Hopefully, they're relatively straightforward enough. I don't even know if I have a description of them in here, but um, I think you can probably figure out what each of them means. But um, so here's a little vignette. Assume you're a 50-year-old supervisor or somebody, in the last, 10 to 20 years of their working lives probably. They're earning, say, 70,000 or whatever you think is appropriate. Maybe today they're earning 80 or 90. This is a fairly old example I've got here. But they've got a mortgage to pay. They've got two car payments. They've got high school age children who may go off to college or university soon. And then suddenly they find themselves out of work through no fault of their own. Let's say maybe the company just went out of business, or they laid people off because they weren't doing as well as they wanted to, or because some arbitrary management just decided they wanted fewer people in their workplace. And of course, managers quite often get compensated very nicely for decreasing the workforce, for seemingly to increase the productivity of the organization. More about that some other time. Um, so what would your needs be? So you've been earning a decent salary, not a earth-shattering salary, but a decent salary. You're having a nice middle class life, and you get children that you want to invest in or help them get started, and then suddenly you're out of work. What was motivating you before? Maybe self-esteem, maybe even self-actualization. Getting that nice promotion with the corner office, or winning that sales award, or something in the higher or something in the higher order needs being fulfilled. And now suddenly you have no job. What's the first thing that goes to your mind? That how am I going to keep paying the mortgage? Am I going to have to sell my cars? What will my children do? Will I have to send them out to work? Or do I get to send them to Acadia University for a first class education? So yeah, you can see how your needs change pretty dramatically to, keeping a roof over your family's head, worrying about your security, the security of your family, and so those are lower level needs, and then also losing your friends at work. So you also have social needs that might suddenly just disappear, or the satisfaction of those needs just suddenly disappears. And so those are all lower level needs that you now have to go back to paying attention to, even though just days before you were probably focused more on higher level needs of esteem and self actualization. So, what are I think you can see that Maslow's theory has it makes sense in some way, right? It's not completely divorced from reality. There does seem to be some content there that makes sense. Problem is that when we try to apply Maslow's theory to real world observation, it doesn't really match very well. We have a hard time using it to predict behavior out in the real world. And so it's not a good theory from a prediction of behavior point of view. Some of the theories we're going to look at in the process theories are much better predictors. So that's one of the reasons why Maslow today would be possibly left out of management textbooks, because it's not as good a theory from a predictive point of view, which is kind of like, in many areas of work, it's kind of considered a gold standard. If we can predict behavior or the influences of behavior, then that's that's the sort of the gold standard. And Maslow just doesn't measure up in that sense. So one of another problem is that the primary needs aren't always the lowest in the hierarchy. We might be working on self-actualization needs, like you guys perhaps. At the same time, we can't look after our physiological needs. Our parents are still paying the bills, for instance, even at the same time while we're working on self-esteem and self-actualization. Um, and our values influence our needs as well. So some people might be very satisfied to go out and work on those lower level needs to begin with, or maybe for the rest of their lives, and they just don't value higher level needs in the same way. It's in that sense, I think they're kind of like learned needs. It's not that there's something innately defective in those people, but they haven't learned those to value higher level needs the same way that others have. So the I guess the conclusion is that needs can vary from person to person. It's not so universal of a theory. I spend only a very little time on these next couple of slides, just in the name of timeliness. So, a development of Maslow's hierarchy was Hertzberg's motivation hygiene theory, sometimes referred to as the two-factor theory. Basically, the lower level needs match up with Hertzberg's hygiene factors, or what might be described as dissatisfiers. So if you're, as an example, hygienes tend to be extrinsic rewards like pay and recognition and things like that. If they're not satisfactory, then that tends to lead us to be dissatisfied with the job, but they're not factors that tend to motivate us. Those are called satisfiers. So motivators tend to be intrinsic rewards. The content of our work is intrinsically motivating. We experience achievement, recognition, challenging work, interesting work, and so on. And so those tend to be intrinsic factors of motivation. And in Hertzberg's two-factor theory, they're called satisfiers or motivators, as opposed to hygiene factors, which lead to dissatisfaction. So hygiene factors, something like your salary, your compensation plan, for instance. If it's not satisfactory, you may be motivated at your job, but you might also be dissatisfied at the same time. And then there was McClelland's learned needs, and I think all of these can find their roots in roughly the 1960s. I'm going to say Hertzberg might go back to the 1950s, 50s or 60s. You can probably find the original research underpinning Hertzberg's work. For instance, it's just look for two-factor theory or. Anyway, and the next one I want to talk about briefly is McClelland's learned needs theory. So this is a little different in that the needs, need for achievement, need for affiliation, need for power. So they're slightly different than Maslow's theory, but there's a little bit of alignment there too. But the major difference here is that McClelland claimed that these were needs that were learned. They were not necessarily innate to the individual. So I wanted to spend a couple of minutes on need for power. If you look at in class, I'll show you a couple of pictures actually of managers from Tesla. One guy, well, he's not so much a manager; he's their chief designer, Hans Hans Wolfhausen, and I'm going to mess up his last name. And the other guy, I can't remember his name, but he heads up their manufacturing in Texas. And these guys both have an enormous amount of power, especially Hans, in that he is the chief designer, and his vision for the design of the vehicles is basically part of a revolution in ground transportation. Everything from taxis right through to semi-trailers, semi-truck trailers, were designed by Hans, and then the other fellow in the picture, and I wish I could remember his name. Anyway, they were both featured at the robot event a week and a half ago in Hollywood, and but he's putting manufacturing processes into place that are revolutionizing the way things are made, not just cars, but the way things are made. And so both of these guys are changing the face of automotives and in particular manufacturing and design These are being changed by these two guys. So they have an enormous amount of influence and power. And of course, they choose to work at a place like Tesla because they have the opportunity to exercise that power in a very fundamental way. More theory I'll spend a little bit of time on. This one is maybe more important than the last couple, but to me it is anyway, because it's so fundamental. And I see this sort of thinking uh, like almost every day in both American and Canadian culture, and it makes me angry to tell you the truth. But basically, McGregor is he's sort of looking at he's taking. I don't know the origin story of this theory, but he's basically blending stuff from Maslow and Hertzberg and these other theorists, and he's saying, well, it's like managers look at the world one of two ways. Either it's the theory X manager, which is who works on the assumption that employees dislike work, they're lazy, they dislike responsibility, and you have to coerce them into to get them to perform. So think of that cartoon right at the top of the presentation, sort of like that, right? That the only way you'll get people to work to perform is to punish them if they don't, to be hovering over them and watching them, and this is not a strong manager. If you think this now, you're not going to be a strong manager because I mean because of COVID in particular, but not just because of COVID, but more people work at a distance from their workplace. So if you're one of these managers who assumes all these things about workers, you're going to drive yourself crazy every day. On the other hand, you could be a theory Y manager and you could work under the assumption that employees like work, that they bring their creativity to work, and that if they're working on something that they care about, that they buy into the mission of the organization in particular, they'll seek responsibility, right? They'll exercise self-direction and self-motivation. You don't have to hang over them all the time. So I see this virtually every day, and it drives me crazy. And we see it in American culture in particular, and in particular in many of the political discussions these days. That so many people assume that people are just the only thing they're interested in is taking advantage of employers or the state or whatever, right? They're just lazy. They don't want to actually perform or work for anything. So this is one of the reasons that a universal basic income will probably fail. At least in the U.S., I think it'll fail because, or parts of the U.S. at least, it will fail because there's such a cultural underpinning to not giving people something for nothing. Now, that's not really what universal basic income is about, but that's the way they see it. They do not like it. So they tend to be theory X people who think of the people who receive stuff like that as lazy and who don't want to work for their living and so on. But what if you changed the way you looked at people into a theory Y manager? What would that difference mean to you and to them and to society as well? So I like this theory a lot. So here are those theories lined up against each other. I think one's missing. Theory X, theory Y is missing. But you can see there's a great deal of overlap between the five theories really, but in particular these four, they are um, they line up very closely. And in fact, Alderfer's, I forgot about Alderfer's name there, but he is ERG, which stands for existence, relatedness, and growth. This is a very close rendition of Maslow's hierarchy, but he's basically simplified it into three factors instead of five or more. And what we find is that this is a slightly better predictor of behavior in the workplace than this is, and that's than Maslow's hierarchy uh, because of that simplification. So anyway, but they're really very very similar. So a kind of quick and easy way to line up the four against each other, and then we could put theory X and theory Y over here. Theory X would probably tend to be down here, that people are only interested in as much free stuff for their social needs and their give me a free home and stuff like that. And whereas theory Y managers might tend to work on the assumption that workers are naturally attracted to the need for esteem and growth and actualization and achievement and so on, right? So you might also put theory X and theory Y here. So here's another example. This is a little bit out of date, but I remember this from a textbook I used, God, 20 or 30 years ago, probably, maybe 30 years ago now. But imagine your employer gives out small monetary awards, like $5 from 20, 30 years ago. It was like maybe I don't know 30, 40, 50 today or something like that. But would you what they found in their particular office, because everybody was probably relatively well paid at this office. So what value would an extra $5 have? So these little high five awards would mean more to the individual as a sort of certificate on the wall than for the $5. So this is what I was saying earlier about my own experience winning that small financial award for an ethics in business project, and it was $2,000. Well, 2,000 made no difference in my life. I probably just put it on, paid off debt or something with it. But what a difference it might have made if they'd bought this really, really, kick-ass, certificate with a really nice frame and then delivered it with a bouquet or something like that, or maybe a bottle of champagne, Dom Perignon or something like that. That would have been, now that would have really kicked ass. And so anyway, I think about what is really important. Is it the intrinsic, or is it the extrinsic, and so on, right? So in one of the in your multiple choice questions, actually, I think you'll see some a question or two dealing with the implications of different motivation theories. And so here is a list of some of the implications of content theories, the ones we've been looking at so far. Um, we should recognize that people have different needs at different points in their life, right? If I'm younger, I might be more motivated by money, like because maybe my base salary is 50,000, which is just enough today to live on, and an extra 5,000 might make a huge difference to me. On the other hand, if I'm already earning six-figure salary, what deal is another couple $1,000s? Something that is more intrinsically rewarding might be much more appropriate. Imagine for instance, the doctor who works in a hospital for three or four or $500,000. What difference is another $1,000 to that doctor? Virtually nothing. But recognition, something that feeds his intrinsic motivators, that could be huge, right? A new position, or becoming the chair of something, or some sort of something that allows him to or her to self-actualize, that feeds their higher level needs, their esteem, could make a big difference. So offer employees a choice of rewards, not just one sort of award or reward fits everybody. Do not rely too heavily on financial rewards, because they mainly address lower level needs. And once you get to a certain point, financially, they have almost no effect on the individual. Don't underestimate the power of lower level needs, on the other hand. So it sounds like I'm, being, talking out of both sides of my mouth. And to some extent I am, because content needs, motivators, tend to differ with the person. So sometimes something is as simple perhaps as job security, which isn't all that simple actually in many cases. Imagine remember that vignette I showed you earlier of the guy who's earning 70,000 a year and suddenly finds himself out of work. Uh, how much would job security mean to that individual? Probably a massive amount. And he would probably do almost anything to maintain that job security. So, and then also don't underestimate intrinsic motivation. What is in the individual, right? What is innate to the individual? Let them discover what will work for them, what they want to do, rather than being forced into a particular life. So here's the beginning of the process theories of motivation. And first, I'm going to talk about equity theory. It's a fairly simple theory of motivation, and it's so easy to use to explain why people might feel unfairly treated in the workplace. So it deals with two questions. What do people think is fair and equitable? And how do they respond when they feel they are getting far more or far less than they deserve? So the theory suggests that people are capable and willing to perceive fairness in their immediate environment. And don't underestimate how important to motivation fairness is. If you feel you're being treated unfairly, it will kick the hell out of your motivation. So people act in the light of what they regard as fair. I wish I had a better illustration of equity theory in my notes here, but in class I will do a better job of illustrating it on the whiteboard. But basically, in equity theory, one version of equity theory at least, we look at the ratio of what we receive, our outcomes, to what we put in, our inputs. And then we compare our outcomes to inputs to some other person's outcomes and inputs. And so it looks like an equation with outcomes divided by inputs for two individuals. And we start with the assumption that they're equal, but then the individual will compare themselves to this other individual and decide if they're being equitably treated or not. So this is one version of equity, by the way. This is not the only version, but this is one that shows up frequently in business studies. There are others, though. And in fact, I'd urge you to think about the difference between equity and equality. What do you think the difference is between those two? So how does this work? So if I look at another person and I see that they're doing roughly the same work as I am, they've got the same degrees, they're producing the same amount of research and teaching and all that sort of stuff, but they've already been promoted, let's say, and I'm having difficulty getting promoted, even though on the face of my work, I deserve it as much as they do. So in other words, their outcomes are greater than my outcomes because they've already received a promotion. So let's say I'm stuck at the associate level and they've already been promoted to the full professor level, then they've received more outcomes than I have. And we've really been doing virtually equivalent sort of levels of contribution to the workplace. And arguably, maybe in some areas, I've been doing more than the other person. So why is it fair that they have received greater outcome? So you can see how this could be portrayed as an equation where the ratio for the other person, the comparator, is greater than my ratio. And so that leads me to feel like I'm being treated unfairly. And by the way, this happens in your business school, among your business professors all the time, because so many of them are so small and stupid. I hope enough of you hear this. So here's another illustration of this, the ratios I was talking about in equity theory. So think about this first example here where, so you are on the right and your outcomes are in blue and your inputs are in green. That's your ratio of outcomes to input. So outcomes might be wages or recognition or promotion or whatever. And my inputs are, the degrees, the qualifications I bring to the job, um, what I produce and how much I produce and so on. And then I look at somebody else and they're contributing roughly the same amount I am in terms of inputs, but their outcomes are much lower. So this is a possibility. What if I feel over? What if there's if we do this ratio sort of comparison with somebody else, and we feel over rewarded compared to them? What does that motivate us to do? Do we ask for less money? No, I don't think so. Do we give our promotions back? No, I don't think so. So what do we do? Because if there's this difference between ourselves and somebody else, there's a tension. And we don't, humans tend not to like this tension. It's a psychological tension. We tend to do things to remove that tension. So I see some of my colleagues in the business school who deserve to be promoted just as much as many of their other colleagues who have already been promoted. And that creates a tension for me. It makes me angry. And so what do? I get involved in their committees. And when their colleagues actively do things to undermine their promotion applications, I fight back because I don't think it's fair. So it's not my fairness that's in question. It's how the organization treats their fairness. So that's one of the things I do. That's not what everybody does, but it's one thing that I do. Now imagine it in the reverse, where you look at that comparison other, and they're getting way more outcomes compared to you, like that promotion, higher wages, and greater recognition. But really, you're doing almost the exact same job. So how do you respond in that case? Do you go in and demand a promotion? Do you go in and demand more wage? Do you go in and, or do you, maybe you withhold some of your contribution to the organization to bring that ratio back into a better, so that it represents a better comparison with these other people or other person. Here's an example that you might relate to, because I'm sure this has happened to you. Have you ever received a lower grade than you thought you deserved, only to find out that others that you considered to be poorer students had gotten better grades? And how did you feel? See, this is equity or inequity in action. You can feel it. Can you not feel it? Think of an example. How did you feel? Here's another example. So Sue started work as an accountant at a local hospital after graduation from college. During 2 years on the job, she had been pleased with her progress until she discovered that two new college graduates with no experience had been hired at slightly more than she was making. She immediately started looking for work elsewhere. And so think about that. If you witnessed this kind of inequity in the workplace, and if you were Sue, how would you feel? How would you respond? Would you quit? Or before you quit, would you start looking for other work so you could quit? Would you go into your boss and complain? Would you ask for a promotion or for a raise? Would you withhold some of your effort? Well, how would you respond? And each of us would probably respond a little differently, right? Because we feel that unfairness differently, and because we probably perceive our prospects in life differently as well. And so we would respond differently. So here are some more examples. Um, if we were over rewarded, for instance, maybe we would reduce, or we felt over rewarded, maybe we would reduce our inputs, or this would be under reward, I guess. Um, if we felt under rewarded, we'd start withholding some of our effort. So this less organizational citizenship, by the way, I've mentioned this in class before, but let me mention again. So there are these things called OCBs, sometimes referred to as OCBs, organizational citizenship behavior. And one of your other professors may talk about it in his class. I don't generally talk about it in class because for me it's just another way to manipulate and exploit workers. But it's important to some people. So there you go. It's an OCB, an organizational citizenship behavior. So if you're feeling inequitably, unfairly treated, maybe you start withholding some of your contribution to the workplace. And maybe one of those things that you used to contribute was helping new people in the workplace. That's citizenship behavior. Helping new people to find their bearings, to figure out what it is they're supposed to be doing, and so on. Well, maybe you just withhold those things. In fact, that's a valid way of in unionized environments. That's quite often a valid way to complain about poor treatment in the workplace, to withhold the extras that you do that go beyond your employment contract, the requirements of your employment contract. And you'll see some other examples there as well. I'll let you explore those yourself. So just like almost everything else in life, sometimes people just want to label stuff. So if depending on your sensitivity to equity or inequity, you might be a benevolent. You might be tolerant of being under-rewarded. Maybe you don't really, it doesn't really bother you that you didn't get that promotion. I bet you most people, when you scratch hard enough, they'll find that they're not as benevolent as they might seem on the surface, but they have to rationalize it in some way. Or maybe you're an equity sensitive. Now, I've been called an equity sensitive before by one of my friends, in fact, and I don't disagree with that. I do perceive unfairness very, I don't want to say easily, because it is unfairness. It's not like I'm imagining things, but I do tend to be more sensitive toward these things, especially when it's somebody else and not just me. And then sometimes we label people entitled because they prefer receiving proportionally more than others. So am I an entitled or a sensitive or a benevolent? So moving on from equity theory, this is, as I think I mentioned before, among psychology academics, expectancy theory is thought to be the gold standard of motivation theory. And the reason is that it provides a very good theoretical basis for making predictions for how people will behave in the workplace. So if you want more predictable approaches to policy and practice in the workplace, at least with respect to your workers, your subordinates, expectancy theory is not a bad way to examine that particular workplace. So it's another process theory, and it can be applied to pay and other forms of motivation. It admits the possibility that individuals may have different goals or needs, and that individuals, so it sort of ties into needs theory as well. It does fit into needs theory as well, and that individuals may perceive different connections between actions and their achievement of goals. So we still, in needs theory, we still may have, well, we still do have needs. These are called outcomes or valences in expectancy theory. So I actually have a textbook, a Canadian textbook on compensation. And one of the first two chapters of the textbook begins with a discussion of expectancy theory and needs theory, and combining those two into a single sort of model to build compensation systems. So expectancy theory proposes that motivation and work-related behavior can be predicted if we know about workers' strength of desire for various outcomes and the probability of achieving them. So if an outcome or the achievement of an outcome, the possible achievement of an outcome can be made more motivational if we can improve the likelihood that a worker can achieve that outcome. So more about that in a second. see two representations of expectancy theory graphically here in the next couple of slides. Here's a fairly simple one. So imagine, imagine, I've gone through this a couple times in my life, currently going through it. I want to lose weight because it's unhealthy, and my current weight is unhealthy, and I don't like it, and I want to be able to do more stuff. And so if uh, one of the problems I've had especially as I get older, is that I have a harder time seeing the relationship between the effort I make to lose weight and my performance in actually losing weight. And so what that does, or what that says to me basically, is that the effort to performance, you see above there it says E to P, that's the effort to performance expectancy. I have a low expectancy, or I have had a low expectancy as far as the relationship between my effort and my performance of losing weight goes. So I get undermined because I don't see that making the effort, I mean, I may get undermined by not seeing the relationship between effort and actual performance. So think about it in the workplace. I don't undertake a sales call because I have a hard time imagining that my effort in making the sales call will generate a performance. So that's one of the reasons, by the way, if you're, many of you in marketing, for instance, marketing means you're going to have to sell something. And, one of the reasons why in selling, in sales management, you work with the funnel analogy, which is you pour a lot of prospects into the top of the funnel in order to get a one or maybe a few sales out the bottom. You have to process a lot of potential sales in order to get that one sale. A lot of so that if you look at a sale as just, well, I have to work on this one person, inevitably you're going to lose, because one prospect almost never turns into one sale. You need maybe 20 or 100 prospects in order to them into, say, one sale. And I know a little bit about this, of course, because I used to be in the sales game in franchising. And so I was compensated only when people bought a franchise. I was more like a headhunter than a salesman, but it was same idea. So I had to get lots of prospects in order to get that one sale. So it was a difficult business for me because I wasn't built for that. I tended not to undervalue the relationship between effort and performance. And it wasn't just it was that the relationship was uncertain. One year I did exceedingly well converting everybody I met virtually into a sale. But then other years I met 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 people and might have gotten 4 sales. And it was tremendously discouraging. So what could I have done in hindsight? What could I have done to increase that expectancy? Now, another part of the model is the performance to outcome expectancy. So if I do sell that franchise, as an example, what will result? And so, interestingly enough, in the franchise business, some franchisors paid a lot more than other franchisors. So these are the companies that are franchising their business. So one franchise company I worked with, they basically would set up flooring businesses in small markets. It was called Nationwide, I believe. And I sold one of these one year, and I got paid. Now this is like 30 years ago, so the money was different then. I think I got paid about I think I got paid about 17,000 American, which turned into about 25,000 Canadian, maybe more than that Canadian. So it was a lot of money for a single sale. That was a good payday. And of course 25,000, 30 years ago, 25, 30 years ago, that was real money. That was a lot of money. But on top of that, the franchisor sent me a bottle of Dom Perignon uh, champagne, and in a nice case and everything, and a tray of fancy cookies, I think it was, and which I shared with the rest of the office building I worked in. I had an office in, And that was a nice treat, to treat the people that worked for me essentially. And so if I'm looking around at the franchise companies that I could uh, present to my clients, the people who are looking for a business opportunity, they would be right on the top of my list because they paid so well. So in a sales business, money really mattered, especially in a sales business that was so difficult and where the paydays could come so far apart. If I could get a $25,000 payday compared to in some cases, $8,000 payday, I'm going to work on the $25,000 payday. So the franchisor was looking at the long term. Yes, it cost them a lot more money to pay us as headhunters in the short term, but they were looking at the long term growth of their network and how much they would make over, 5, 10, 20 years rather than just what they would make or what they had to pay me in the short term. And that influenced my behavior. And at the time, it was an outcome I really valued because I needed to make a living, right? And so I could sell three, I guess, $8,000 paydays, or I could sell one $25,000 payday. Which would you do, right? And so I was motivated to put in the effort to sell that one. Unfortunately, I only ever sold one. Anyway, but that gives you some idea, right? And at that time, as I say, the outcome I valued was the money, but it also felt good to make the sale. But it was the money, of course, that really motivated me because without that money, I had no business. I was out of business. So thinking of that graphic that I just showed you, what can I do to increase the effort to performance expectancy? So one thing we can do from an employer point of view and from an HR perspective especially is make sure we select qualified people who have the skills, training or whatever it's required to do that job effectively. Because we hire people who are not well qualified, they're less likely to realize a relationship between effort and performance. Um, so in academia, for instance, we actually at a small university like Acadia, we quite often hire people who have not completed their PhDs yet, but we do it in the understanding that they will do it fairly soon. But if they don't complete their PhD, if there's a chance they won't complete their PhD, we tend to rate their application lower than others. And part of the reason is that we don't want, in order to be promoted, once they become an academic, in order to be promoted to assistant and associate and full professor, they have to have a completed PhD. So their effort in terms of reward will be very low if they don't complete the PhD. So we are very concerned about that. So we also want to make sure they have sufficient resources to do their, to realize that relationship between effort and performance. If that means more training, if it means, various software tools or maybe assistance or whatever it happens to be. We make sure we provide clear roles. This is what we want you to do, and this is what we want you to achieve. If we can't express those job expectations, those task expectations very clearly, it's going to be confusing and even more difficult for the employee to realize um, uh, their performance. How do we perform if we don't know what it is we're supposed to be doing? Training, as I mentioned, coaching, feedback, and so on. All kinds of things we can do to increase that effort to performance. And then what about if they do achieve their performance, will they realize an outcome that is valued? Um, so we can do things like measure performance accurately, provide higher rewards to better performers. So if everybody receives the same reward, that's hardly motivating for people who actually provide the better performance. So this is one reason why, there's an argument made for pay for performance. It's not a convincing argument all the time, but sometimes it really makes sense. And let me give you an example. Um, and this is a dangerous example to use at this time of year as we're coming up on the U.S. election. But Elon Musk, about 6 years ago, he was given a contract which was 100% performance based. If he achieved certain performance goals, which included the overall value of the firm, growing the overall value of the firm by about 10 times, and he achieved all of those outcomes in about 5 years inside the time frame of the contract. And so the organization awarded him what would have been at the time shares worth more than $50 billion. That's billion with a B. And so some people said, oh my God. Actually, when they first gave him that contract, many people said, oh, it's impossible. Nobody would take that contract. But he did take that contract. Most people would take some sort of, even at that elevated level organizationally or leader in terms of leadership, they would take some combination of salary and bonuses of some sort. Excuse me. And but he took the whole thing in performance-based reward, and huge. But he valued control more than money. He valued control of the organization. So compensation in the form of shares, which was what was valued at more than $50 billion, that was not only did it have a monetary value, it had a control value to him. And he could continue to use Tesla to build a business that fulfilled his vision, his mission, and not somebody else's. So his vision, without those shares, his vision would get watered down to some, probably some barely recognizable minimum sort of outcome. He wasn't prepared to do that. He wanted the reward, the outcome, to give him that kind of power to shape the organization into the mission that he wanted fulfilled. So that was very important to him, and he achieved it. And then a judge in Delaware came along and arbitrarily took it away from him. And that judgment of a judge in Delaware, where the company has been incorporated up until recently, at least, that took that away from both us, me as an investor in Tesla, and Elon Musk, because he delivered a company that grew in value by 10 times. Now that benefited all shareholders. So he should have received his reward. And it's more complicated than that, but anyway, you can see how you could use expectancy theory to evaluate what he was motivated by in that particular instance. So we could increase outcome valences. And so he wasn't rewarded, Musk, he wasn't rewarded with money, he was rewarded with control, which could be turned into money. But there's more to it than that, of course. He wasn't allowed to sell those shares for a number of years. So it didn't even have immediate monetary value to him. He could use the shares, of course, to maybe borrow money and stuff like that. Like he wasn't going to be destitute. He wasn't going to be poor. But it's interesting how the structure of the compensation was, influenced his motivation and the appropriateness of that particular plan, that compensation plan. So as I mentioned, expectancy theory is one of the best models available to predict work effort and what will work for particular individuals. So in this graphic, you can see a very slightly more more nuanced model. We have the addition of personal goals there out at the left or at the right. And so outcomes are, that third box in organizational rewards, those are outcomes. And if the outcomes are not valued by the individual, in other words, they don't have an appropriate valence for that individual, then they're not going to value the organizational rewards as much. So if you need money, when the organization comes along and says, "Oh, here's another certificate for your wall," that's not going to be enough. Maybe you do want that money. For somebody who already has a six-figure income, let's say, and that extra money doesn't make a big difference, what else would fulfill that personal goal? So, as suggested here in the green box, what happens to worker expectancies and effort when an employer follows a policy of across-the-board pay increases for all employees over a period of years? So, we might, because this isn't universal, but we might tend to expect that the good performers might not like being treated the same as everybody else, who might be average or below average performers. Good performers tend to want to be recognized for that good performance. So how do we build that in to a compensation plan? Here's another vignette, another scenario. Imagine a situation in which a bank employee is denied leave to attend the funeral of his partner's father. What kind of performance would you have expected from this employee for the next few days? Can you use the two-factor theory to explain why he left the bank's employ a few weeks later? So the two-factor theory, I'm referring back to Hertzberg's two-factor theory, or the hygiene motivator theory, which we looked at under content theories. But let's look at it from an expectancy theory point of view, first of all. So this employee has a personal need. In this particular model, it's called a goal, but a personal need. And his organizational rewards don't do anything without time off to attend that funeral and support his partner. All the other rewards he receives are meaningless in that particular situation. So if you follow the chain of events back to his effort, we could predict, I think, reasonably well that his effort might be compromised because his personal needs are not being looked after by his employer. And his request is not an unusual request. I don't think anybody would say, "Oh, that's terribly unreasonable to ask for a few days off to go to a funeral." That, blah, 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 right? That would not be unreasonable. And so what kind of effect would that have on his individual effort? And then in terms of two-factor theory, being able to take some time off is not a motivator, but it certainly could be thought of as a hygiene factor, a dissatisfier. So not being able to take that time off to support his partner is likely to lead to dissatisfaction. So he may still be motivated to do his particular job, but it would increase his dissatisfaction with his employer. And so even though he's motivated to do the job, he may say, I can no longer respect. I'm so dissatisfied with this employer. I can no longer respect this employer. I have to leave. I have to quit, or some other outcome, right? And so we can explain this with both need theories, I think, as well as expectancy theory. So once again, as with content theories, expectancy theory, one of the things we have to conclude is that individuals will differ. We have different needs, right? And so that far right portion of the graphic for expectancy theory, that's where our individual differences, some of the individual differences come in. We can also have individual differences at the various expectancy nodes as well. The theory predicts that as an employer, you can increase the effort employees expend by increasing the expectation that greater effort will lead to a higher level of performance by strengthening the perceived link between results and rewards, and by ensuring that employees value the rewards given for high performance. So that one paragraph is kind of like an expression of the entire theory, all wrapped up into one little sentence. So once again, let's conclude with a more arm's length uh, a summation of the motivation theory. And so despite being one of the most researched topics, that is motivation, there isn't conclusive evidence to suggest that motivated workers will be more productive workers. So we're spending all this time studying how to motivate workers, and yet the research evidence on motivating workers in terms of its effect on productivity is equivocal. It's uncertain. It varies. So why do we spend so much time on something that has such uncertain outcomes? However, despite what I just said, there seems to be agreement that motivation is more complex than initially theorized. It's very individual, and the context itself matters a great deal. So it's not just the characteristics of the individual, it's the characteristics of the situation as well. And these are complex. It may take time to figure them out. And even after you have seemingly figured them out, maybe the context has changed or the individual has changed. And so you need to reevaluate what you're doing for motivation. And then finally, more recent theorizing recognizes the agency of the employee and the presence of self-motivation, which might be entirely unrelated to how a manager attempts to motivate. In other words, maybe the manager is irrelevant. Now, that's not entirely true, but maybe, in terms of the effort to motivate, I would say make sure that your workplace treats employees fairly as possibly, equitably. And, if you assume theory Y manager assumes workers want to work and that they're creative, let them do their jobs. Give them the working conditions that will allow them to do their jobs. And they will be innately motivated, intrinsically motivated. Just my thoughts.